Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Responsibly podcast with me, Charlie Martin. As a reminder, Responsibly is a show about marketing practices that not only achieve results, but to do so with integrity. So today I was delighted to be joined by Johannes Wassenberg. Johannes is a real expert in all things sustainability and finance, having been COO of Moody's ESG Solutions Limited for some time. He's since gone on to found S Cubed Strategic Sustainability Solutions, which is a fascinating organization that's looking to do some very interesting things in essentially like financial and sustainability modeling. So it's going to be really an interesting conversation for anyone that's interested in the kind of finance, ESG, sustainability kind of spheres. And Johannes offers us lots of really interesting insights during this conversation. In terms of the article, the particular focus for the conversation that we had, we looked at an article by EY that looked at the importance of ESG disclosures in initial public offerings and got Johannes's take on that and the impact of incorporating sustainability into every facet of the way an organization not only operates, but in terms of the way that they look to model themselves financially and within their kind of corporate structures. So fascinating conversations coming at a very different kind of perspective and angle when it comes to, you know, some of these key issues around sustainability and how it affects things from a finance perspective. So just want to say a big thank you to Johannes for joining us and for sharing his expert insights. As always, really keen to hear any feedback and thoughts that you guys might have on today's show. If you've got any questions specifically for Johannes, etc., please do provide your comments. Enjoy. Thank you. Johannes, thank you so much for agreeing to join us today. I know that we've met and got to know each other over the last few months, and it was always really keen to get you onto the Responsible Edge if we possibly could snaffle you. So yeah, great to have you on board. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you very much. I look forward to it.
Top man. So Johannes, as we kind of mentioned in our preamble, to kind of kick things off, just be really interested to kind of hear a bit of background on you and your career and perhaps sort of, you know, the inspiration behind the work that you've done and what you're looking to do moving forward.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. So if I look back, first of all, you know, where am I today? I've set up a company called S Cubed Strategic Sustainability Solutions. That is obviously has a specific angle in the sustainability space, focusing on the ability of companies to be sustainable. I think there's a market gap in that because there's a lot of focus on companies' transition plans, on all the disclosures they do in their own reports, etc. But I think the bigger picture is, you know, when you think about what sustainability is, it's about, you know, internalizing negative externalities, i.e. the costs that companies have imposed on other stakeholders and didn't have to pay for themselves. Increasingly, they have to own up to these costs. And that's a bit, you know, where did I come from? I always actually like to understand why things happened. And as a background, I've been working as a financial analyst and managing director in one of the two big rating agencies called Moody's Investor Service. And when ESG sort of, you know, became more noticeable, probably 9-10 years ago, I was actually quite skeptic about it because I'd been an analyst, you know, believe it or not, in the early 2000s when there was a previous round, perhaps not on with focus on environment, but really actually more on governance, following a lot of the corporate scandals, Enron, WorldCom, Parmalat, etc. And Moody's put a lot of effort into it. I was involved in some of those exercises to get a better grip on governance. And ultimately, you know, that failed because we really didn't have sufficient data to distinguish ex ante, so before the event, you know, to distinguish really which companies would fail, which wouldn't. With hindsight, it's obviously, you know, bloody obvious in most cases, but you know, before the event, it was difficult. So when ESG came in 2015, I said, oh, here we go again. So I was one of the skeptics. I put my hand up. But that's why I think my curiosity took hold and said, okay, obviously this is here. So why is it here? Where did this come from? So I spent a lot of time, you know, thinking myself, but also talking to a lot of other people who came more from the sustainability world, some really early acolytes, and trying to understand, okay, what are the long trends or secular trends, paradigm shifts, etc., that resulted in ESG being there. And so for me, I discovered, but what made sense to me was there were three great trends. One was, population growth. We're now 8 billion, going to be 10 billion in a few decades, up from 2 billion in 1950. So obviously the planet is becoming quite crowded. And when it didn't matter if you polluted the waters around you when you were 2 billion people, obviously when you're 8 or 10 billion, it matters a far larger deal. So that's one thing. Second thing is that obviously stakeholders, so everybody, has higher expectations. On the one hand, high expectations for living standards, which puts pressure on the planet, but also high expectations of good living standards, because of course social media nowadays, everybody, even in the remotest corner of the African desert, perhaps, or some in the jungle in Southeast Asia or Latin America, people have access to mobile phones and can see how the rest of the world lives. So dual pressure. On the one hand, yes, they want part of that lifestyle, but also people want better living circumstances and conditions. So that's the second thing. And the third thing, what we didn't have in 2002, 2003, but we have now, is big data. So we were aware of some of these negative externalities, the costs that companies imposed on everybody else, but you couldn't really measure it. Now with satellite imagery, with the ability to analyze satellite imagery and all the other things that are out there with big data, you can sort of start putting a picture together of some of these externalities. So if you can identify them and you can start measuring them, then you can start managing them. So I think, therefore, we are in a very different place than we were 20 years ago. And that's what really got me, I think, focused on sustainability, not as a fad, as a trend, but as something that is really the next big challenge, paradigm change that, is not an optional thing. It's not something that it's woke or anti-woke or whatever. It's something that is here, something we need to deal with. And something companies need to deal with. And you can choose to obviously ignore it for a certain period of time, but it will come back to haunt you. So for me, being able to play a bit of a part and providing some transparency in this big puzzle that we're all part of, I think is very attractive, and I hope with my startup I can be successful and ultimately help allocating resources more efficiently, which is what's required. So long story to a bit about me, but I thought I'd give you a bit of that background. And as I mentioned a bit before, I've been basically in financial analysis for 25 years. The last 4 years I actually was the chief operating officer of Moody's ESG solutions. Until a year ago, roughly. And so for building an in-house startup and scaling up from 3 people to nearly 1,000 people, including a couple of acquisitions we made, a lot of organic growth, etc. And yeah, economist by training. Let me stop there and back to you.
Yes, for those of you, I am going to have to share this because it has been an on-running joke that you and I have had since we first met. But I should say to our listeners, we did the terrible job of misnationalizing Johannes when we first met him. It's explaining that he was, or expecting him to be, South African, but in actual fact, Johannes is from Germany. So I must again, in a public forum, Johannes, apologize for that misnationalizing of yourself. Let me ask you, that was fascinating in terms of hearing the kind of the potted history of those sort of 20 years and what happened in the early to mid 2000s and how that was different in 2015. In 2015, when you were a skeptic of ESG and you were looking at it, you mentioned those 3 kind of areas that kind of manifested, I guess, the value in your mind that of you realizing this is going to be a really important thing. Do you recall, just talk around that, when you started to look into it skeptically, like what were the first kind of major insights or triggers, if you like, where you started to think, hold on a minute, this actually could be far more significant and important moving forward for Moody's, etc.?
I had a conversation with a former colleague of mine who I respect a lot, Anna Zubitz-Anderson, who's actually an accounting specialist at Moody's, but then she, how should I say, jumped on the sustainability bandwagon much before me out of conviction, I think, but also out of insight. And yes, for her, I think she really brought on my radar screen the sort of stakeholder expectations and the dynamic nature of that, and that's something that you can't put that genie back into the bottle. And once you accept that stakeholder expectations are changing, that companies are confronted, first of all, with a much larger group of stakeholders nowadays than there were 15 years ago before the advent of social media. And if you accept that those expectations are changing, I think you can't help but realize that this is a dynamic that wherever you stand politically, wherever you stand on climate change, whatever, but you can't ignore that, right? So I'm not, and I like to be a rational person, and while I have passion for certain values myself, but in a business context, I always like to think, well, what makes sense? What is logical? And I do think, we can't save this planet by appealing to people's good intentions. I mean, that is laudable, but I think I'm just too skeptical and too cynical about that's going to work. You need to find the rationale, the logic, the incentives in that. And I think starting from that perspective, understanding, that it's about now a broader group of stakeholders, about changing expectations. That for me was one of the aha moments around which then other pieces of the puzzle came together.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, I can, having spoken to other people that have sort of discussed, I think, a similar awakening moment, if you like, where the realization was that this was not just here to say, but it was something that needed to be acknowledged and addressed, and there was a great opportunity with getting this stuff right. Johannes, let me, in light of that, ask you to perhaps just, in actual fact, before we go on and talk about the specific article that we're going to sort of dissect together today, when we sort of invited you to come on the Responsible Edge, knowing that obviously our key focus is on the role of marketing and the role that marketing, the positive role that marketing can play if it's managed responsibly and ethically. Like, what does that mean to you? I know you had some interesting comments before that you shared with us around the potential from an internal and external perspective of the marketing function. It'd be fascinating to get your take on that.
So first of all, perhaps full disclosure, I mean, my real only professional exposure with marketing actually was part of my business studies, in a way, when we had to do a bit of business when you did economics. And I knew very quickly that wasn't my avenue. I probably didn't feel creative enough, etc., to go down that route. But having said that, I think, when I also was a COO for Moody's ESG Solutions, I like to think, holistically. I like to understand how the different capabilities of an organization work together and how they need to work together. And for me, marketing is a function that is actually sort of a bit of a glue in a lot of what the company does. Now you can treat it as a sort of like a afterthought, or okay, these are the marketing guys. They basically they are just takers of certain bits and they make the best of it. Or you can take it as a much more, I think, embedded, strategic tool that you have. And I think especially in this kind of change that we're facing, where you're moving from an environment where basically as a let's say XO, CEO, CFO, CO, whatever, if you in the past were good at dealing with, let's say, 5-6 stakeholders, right? You had to deal obviously with the customers, you had to deal with your shareholders, you had to deal with your financiers or bankers, so whoever gave the capital markets who provided you with the loans and the credit. You had to deal with obviously employees. You had to deal with your suppliers, and then to some extent, if you're regulated with the regulatory body, the political body, etc. But if you basically manage those 5 to 6 stakeholders well, you more or less probably did well as a company. What you now need to realize is that there are many other stakeholders out there, and their relationship to you as a company is non-linear. So it's not that you can predict, if I do this, they do that, right? Because their expectations may be shaped by other things. So it's a much more dynamic environment. And I think the marketing department in that evolution with the tools they have to listening out to customers, and to broader trends, etc., and so shaping and translating that into what it means for the company, etc. I think they can play a pivotal role in helping the company evolve from let's say the old-fashioned 5 stakeholder kind of model to the new multi stakeholder model, non-linear that we're facing. So I think marketing can actually, if it really wants and has a trust of the company to play this, can play an immensely important role in helping the company succeed in this transition.
And is that, Johannes, just to pry into that in a bit more depth, is that because you see that kind of that feedback function, that kind of that exploration and understanding of opinions and perspectives and ways of viewing what we as a company are doing, that's the key aspect, that marketing can facilitate the engagement that leads to those insights being established?
I think that's one of the two. So obviously the other one is, so one is basically being the bridge from the outside world into the internal world.
Mm-hmm.
But the reverse is equally true, right? Being the bridge from the internal to the outside world. So I think it can also play a really, really important role in being the communicator, being the messenger, and helping the outside world understand what the inside is about, what the company is about, how the company is evolving, how it is, trying, what its strategy is, how it's trying to achieve its strategy in line with whatever sustainability goals the company has set itself. So I think, again, amidst all the noise, amidst all the changes, it can play a super critical role in helping, being that sort of intermediary, let's say, between the outside world and the inside world, not just between the customers, but between suppliers, perhaps even with employees, trade unions, with suppliers, with other communities out there, with so with all these other stakeholders,
multifaceted communication sort of entities, and the requirement for engagement with all of them.
Exactly. So it's obviously a huge challenge. It's not something that probably comes easily to anybody, but I think the marketing department probably has the tools, perhaps the thinking of always having an ear on the outside world ground, let's say, that it's probably the closest to be able to adapt to that role rather than anybody else in the company.
And I pry into this a little bit further, and I know this will relate to the work that you're doing or what you're building with S-Cubed, but is there, you mentioned this, I think, in your initial feedback to us, where you talked about strategy versus reality, and how the marketing, when we talk about responsible, ethical marketing practice, like that's a key aspect, is the marketing function being used in order to essentially not overpromise, but to ultimately share what's really happening on the ground? And is there a way of positioning that in such a way that the transparency and the honesty and the openness of, this is where we're at, this is where we're looking to get to, this is the reality of what we're doing, that's a key way of ensuring that your marketing is ultimately ethical and responsible? Was that a comment that you made?
Yeah, I 100% agree. And yes, sorry, I agree with my own comments.
Yeah, I was trying to remember it correctly, but yeah.
Well, let's say, if you think about it, I mean, the way I think about sort of sustainability and the company sustainability, it sort of takes 3 ingredients. The first one, called super important, is the willingness, which is obviously then expressed in the vision, mission, strategy, etc. But that's not enough. You also need to then look at, okay, do we have the financial flexibility of a business model to support us on getting to that strategy, right? And in many cases, and I'll come back to that a bit more, but in many cases that, while companies try to focus on, okay, we can have synergies or increase revenue if we do this, but in many cases, it's also very defensive. You need to just adapt to higher environmental standards, to higher social standards in your own operations and in your supply chain. So that comes with costs. So it's no, let me come back to that. But so it's about the financial flexibility of your business model to actually be able to support that transition. And it is a transition. And that's the third element. You need to basically have the technological, whatever know-how in your industry you need to pivot your operations to a more sustainable one, whether it's, again, adhering to higher environmental standards. And that may obviously, sometimes you may just be able to buy certain things, but sometimes require complete retooling of the way you operate. So do you have that knowledge to do that? So technical knowledge, financial ability, plus the intention, the willingness, the strategy, those three. So I think the marketing department, again, if it just pins its flag to the master strategy and say, hey, you're going to market the strategy, but completely ignorant of the actual reality on the ground, it may give you a bit of an initial boost, but then soon you'll be caught up by actually not being able to deliver. And so you helped in, whether you call them greenwashing, you helped in over-promising, and ultimately some stakeholders or all stakeholders may be very disappointed very shortly afterwards, because actually you can't follow up. So I think the marketing team needs to understand, yes, this is our strategy, but also where are we today? What is our, ability from a technical perspective, from a business model viability perspective to actually embark on this journey, and how fast can we go? So I think they need to understand that, again, if they want to be playing a role as a real sort of trusted advisor to the C-suite of the company, and also a trusted partner to the stakeholders, that they feel, here's a trusted organ of the company, and actually, and we all know trust is the most valuable thing. And if they can sort of help either establish it or maintain it, I think is critical. But you need to know on all three those dimensions where the company is. You can't just look at one and therefore say, whoopee-doo, here we are and we're great.
And I feel like we could end up with a series called Johannes on the Responsible Edge podcast weekly episodes, which I would never threaten you with. But let me ask you this: in your experience of thinking back to the 25 years that you mentioned being a financial analyst, can you think of any particular examples where the over-promising, the alignment of marketing purely with strategy and not necessarily with reality? Can you think of any kind of examples that jump to mind of where you thought to yourself, or you saw through the analysis that you did, like, these guys have got it terribly wrong?
Well, I think it's difficult to separate marketing from let's say the way the company itself presents itself. So obviously, I don't think that the marketing department can go sort of jump ahead of let's say where the CEO wants it to be, etc. So I mean, for me, typically it's the corporate scandals that come to mind, right? And I mentioned obviously the Enrons, the WorldComs, the Parmalats, who basically create a hype that is actually not taken into consideration those two others. So the strategy, whatever the intention, but actually it's not substantiated by the business model viability or the technical skills, know-hows to get to that strategic point. So whether you look at, mentioned I'm German, obviously Wirecard is a classical case, but pretty much every fraud, I think, is a good example. And a lot of these frauds don't start with a big fraud. They start with small transgressions, and suddenly you build a momentum, and of course you enjoy the momentum. Your share price goes up if you're a publicly listed company. So you think, oh, this is good, and you don't want to burst that bubble, and so you go along with it, and the risk is, so if you miss the point of no return, and you go bigger and bigger and bigger, and at some stage, it's going to come back and bite you. So those are perhaps the examples I think about, and I think that's where a powerful marketing department, can perhaps resist those early temptations and play a really crucial role. Ultimately, if the governance is wrong, I think then we know that even a marketing department can't save the bacon. But I think, as I said, often it starts with small things. It doesn't start with a big intent to defraud others, but it starts with those small things, and you get caught in that. And so a marketing department that understands its responsibility, understands the long-term game it needs to play, in this, because sustainability is not like a 1-year pivot from business model A to business model B. It's going to be a long journey, and you need to basically condition your people. Look, this is a long journey. We need to pace ourselves. We need to go step by step, and and make sure we don't lose the trust that we have amongst our stakeholders, that's going to be critical.
Johannes, let me ask you, that was, again, all of this is absolute gold. But let me ask you this. Your experience when you're CEO at Moody's and you're running your team and you have presumably a marketing department, how did you go about, like, what were the things that you considered or thought about when you were engaging with them in order to ensure that they hit those three key marks that you've alluded to?
So to be honest, I mean, obviously, I know you said it, but I just want to be clear: COO of Moody's ESG Solutions.
Okay. So we'll edit it out. We'll edit that out.
Come across grander than I am in a way, but and then again, there I think our marketing wasn't strategic, so it really was product marketing for our area. Because I mean, we had an overall marketing at Moody's that I did have no influence in. So as much as I would like to give you some examples and insights, but I fear it's not necessarily relevant, because it was really at this stage more really product specific marketing that we were involved in, and so probably not that relevant.
Okay, well, let me step outside of your practical experience and just get your take as a C-level executive on how you go about engaging, or how you would perceive going about engaging with a marketing function within an organization in order to ensure, as I say, those three key elements of what you've described.
Well, I would actually, before picking out or singling out the marketing department, I think but even as a COO, I think what is really important, and I put a lot of value into that, which I think wasn't always reflected sort of among some of my colleagues outside of Moody's ESG, was the importance of having a North Star, having that vision, that alignment of where you want to go. Because I think, and that actually, I mentioned it before, I mean, I was in the army, and for me, there's a German word called Auftragstaktik, which is like a mission-driven tactic. So you provide an objective, but you don't tell people how to get there. But what you need, and actually I learned that also when I was at Moody's, and I actually, when I moved up the managerial ranks, became from initially a manager of individual performers to then a manager of managers, you realize in order to be able to delegate, you need to create an understanding of what you try to achieve and transparency around that. So delegation and trust in return for transparency. So for me, that applies to how you manage a group, how you manage a company. You need to be able to create that vision, that an understanding of where you want to go, plus a certain parameters and values of how you operate. You just be clear what are the don'ts or do's and don'ts of how you operate. But once you've done that, then you can sort of empower them, and you can empower the marketing team if it's got these clear guardrails, and I think be really sort of taking the initiative. And I think, so again, that for me is super important. Create that North Star, that understanding, create transparency. So you need a good business intelligence function that is able to share with everybody where we are. Because if you don't do that, there's a lot of waste, a lot of inefficiencies, because people are duplicating efforts, so they're sort of interpreting things. So you need that, what I call transparency, but it's basically supported by a good business intelligence function, where you basically provide information around the KPIs, etc. So people, feel informed, they know where they need to go and what they need to do. And with that, I think you can create a really powerful team that obviously is highly motivated because they feel empowered, they don't feel micromanaged the whole time. And you can sort of, unleash then their creativity, their energy, etc., whether it's the marketing department, the production team, the sales team, the product development team, etc.
Fascinating. I just want to pick up on one thing. When you talk about the business intelligence function within that scenario, and you talk about transparency, what would you advise if we have any C-level execs out there that are thinking to themselves, right, I've implemented this transparent approach to understanding KPIs and analytics, etc., relating to a business function, and I'm empowering my marketing team to therefore operate within these kind of parameters of the do's and don'ts of the things that we absolutely won't do, but within that space, you're empowered to share and to create messaging essentially that realizes our North Star, our vision. What happens when the business analytics delivers some insight that doesn't align necessarily with that North Star? how does the C-level function within an organization go about mitigating the marketing team using that information inappropriately, or perhaps getting it wrong in terms of their interpretation of that information?
I think that's a difficult question. It's a good question, but it's a difficult one.
Don't worry, we don't have to.
I think you, in my styles, you want to encourage, as I said, you want empowerment, because from empowerment comes motivation and comes, people then enjoying their job, and a lot of positive, sort of externalities, as you talk about that in a way. But that also requires that, obviously, people interpret things differently, and you can't be so precise that ultimately that goes against empowerment again. If you basically are so prescriptive in everything that they can do or can't do, then they just become robots. So therefore, from that follows that you need to sort of have a certain tolerance for deviation, for things going a slightly different way than you want them to. So that's, I think, what you need to make really clear is the guardrails, and find that balance, the guardrails. And if you stuck to those guardrails and you've done something that's different, and even if you failed, then that's the price you need to pay as a company for basically unleashing that energy and those forces. If you then, as a CEO, basically say, "Oh, but yes, you were within the guardrails that I provided, but you still screwed up," and you ding those people, then you basically offset all the positive energy that you basically try to unleash in the first place. And so I think that's where you need to be really disciplined as a leader, and say, look, ultimately, if I feel that they've done wrong, which goes against the interest of the business, I should have been better in setting better guardrails and should be more transparent, right? But you can't blame somebody for using the initiative and perhaps coming up with different outcomes than what you had in mind.
Because coming back to your point about trust, the trust that would be damaged as a result of going back, if you like, on that process and that structure that's been set up for that marketing team to be creative and to essentially flourish in terms of what they're producing, the impact that lack of trust that would develop as a result of being caught, if I'm operating within those guardrails, we get something wrong, or we misinterpret something, or something's not done in quite the way that the C-level executives want it to be done. That's, as you say, on them, and they don't want to damage the trust with their marketing function by saying, look, it's on you. Yeah.
And you always can do like a post-mortem, say, okay, guys, where perhaps do we need to update the guardrails so in the future this doesn't happen again? That's perfectly legitimate, right? But that's, I think, just, yeah, I think it's such a precious good, the trust that you have, and the sort of energy it sets free if people feel they're trusted and they're empowered. I think, and I worked in both kind of organizations, one where everything was micromanaged, and you just lose complete willingness to not to live, but to work for that organization and to really sort of put in the extra mile and the extra hour and everything. Whereas when you're empowered, you fly, you start flying, you just love it. And well, I do, sort of, I really work well in those situations. And I think that's something, a situation I strive to recreate in whenever I ran a team.
I love that. If there are ever any jobs going, then I'd like to throw my name in there. We've done a classic thing. If I've got too excited by the things that you've been talking about so far, and asked you lots of questions about that, and ran through a fair amount of the episode already, but really keen to kind of talk a little bit about the article that we shared with you before the episode, published on EY. Johannes, would you mind just by starting by just providing our listeners with just an overview of what that piece covered, and perhaps just drawing out some of your reflections on any of the insights gleaned from it?
So I think in a nutshell, it establishes a positive correlation between, I think, how an IPO goes and how the share price performs after the IPO, and I think the level of ESG disclosures, right? And I'm not going to go into more detail, but I think for me, and I really like to come on to that, because for me, it's completely logical. Going again to what I said at the beginning, this is not about people thinking, oh, this company is doing good, so I'm sure it'll perform better, and therefore we like it more, therefore the share price performs better. I think there's a completely rational, explanation for that. And let me come back to that, and I hinted at that a bit in terms of the cost. So as I said, I think for me, what sustainability ultimately is, and for me, that's quite important for me to understand that, and I hope listeners can understand that as well, because I think it really is sort of gives you a good angle to understand sustainability. And for me, it's really about the costs that companies have imposed on third parties, either as a role or function of them consuming resources, whether it's manpower or human power, or natural resources, or producing the pollution that's created by that, etc., greenhouse gas emissions, etc. So those costs, some of those, as we said, are reflected in the P&L. The company is accountable for itself. But a lot of those costs have been imposed on third parties without the company being held accountable for that. As I said, when there were 2 billion people in this world, the world could cope with that, was fine. But with 8 or even 10 billion, it's a completely different story. So what sustainability is about, I think, is really trying to identify these negative externalities, right? And make companies own up to these costs. Not all in one go and in one instance, but obviously trying to focus on the most critical ones. And obviously greenhouse gas emissions, climate change are perhaps the elephant in the room, but there are others: pollution, biodiversity, sort of living wage or not paying living wage, so social aspects. So what this is, and from a financial background, for me, it's a bit like your list of contingent liabilities. Or another word, off-balance sheet exposure. So basically exposure that companies are increasingly forced to report on as a contingent liability. So it's somewhere out there, it's lurking somewhere in the bushes, but it's not yet relevant enough to really be shown as a cost. But you have to report on it. So it's a bit like, an eventuality, something, let's say, negative that may happen. So a cost that a company may be forced at some stage to put and reflect in its P&L, and therefore have a lower profit than before. And that's, I think, ultimately what ESG disclosures are about. They're trying to identify the different sources of these costs that companies imposed on third parties. They're trying to measure that. And ultimately, the goal, of course, of all this is for companies then to own up to these costs, and therefore either reducing whatever causes these costs or stopping it completely. And therefore, we get rid of at least some of the most painful externalities. So therefore, those disclosures, in my view, are nothing else but actually providing a more holistic view of those potential risks that a company may be exposed to. And let's face it, the challenges with these kind of risks, we don't know exactly how high those costs are, because, again, coming back to stakeholder expectations, in many instances, it's about what do stakeholders expect. And those expectations obviously can change, right? So you may say, well, actually reducing pollution by 50% meets stakeholder expectations today. Tomorrow, they may say, actually, we want 0%, So therefore, the cost itself is difficult to quantify. And also, you don't necessarily know when it's going to happen. Because on the one hand, you have some visibility with regulatory initiatives, but there's a clear timeline when you have to report, etc. But we all know that regulatory action is only one transmission mechanism, but stakeholder activism is the other transmission mechanism. And that is often unpredictable. Who knows where and when Greta Thunberg will stand on a doorstep tomorrow and protest, So therefore, it's obviously difficult to manage. But as an investor, for example, you want to know what kind of risks, so how high have these costs been that company X has imposed on other stakeholders that are not yet reflected in the balance sheet? So you can make a better assessment of how high, and the technical term we have, maybe the tail risks are for company X versus company Y. So for me, it's a completely logical deduction. It's not, again, that company X has better values and embraces ESG, whatever. It's about company X providing a better picture of potential risks that its operations are causing. So that's, for me, is my nutshell reaction to why I find that article very logical, very conclusive, and again, sort of,
I want to ask you that, Johannes, that was brilliant, by the way. That was a fantastic synopsis. I'm delighted that I asked you to introduce that one. Let me take you back to 2015. And again, you've referenced that point in time when you were an ESG skeptic. In terms of ESG, ESG factors and considerations, as you've just alluded to, manifest themselves in terms of their impact on IPO valuation, et cetera, has that happened as quickly as you thought it would? Or what's been your impression? Because you mentioned there that obviously regulatory impact we can kind of, to a degree, predict, and to a degree kind of factor in and model into things, but that stakeholder engagement is the thing that is the Wild West in many ways. We don't know what's going to become the next big thing on social media that's going to lead to us all going, that's absolutely outrageous from a corporate perspective, and everybody now needs to change the way they behave. Give us your review of, if you like, that 9-year period and the way that ESG factors have grown in terms of consideration.
So, I'm just thinking about, for me, that perhaps, well, let me say a few, so I'm not sure it's going to be 2 or 3 factors to consider. Yeah. So I'll explore that while I'm talking. I think one factor, I guess, let me start with the big picture, right? If you think about it, going back to this internalization of negative externalities, i.e. the companies owning up to the costs they've so far imposed on others, that's a huge value transfer. That's a value transfer, or let's say cost transfer, from Joe Public to company X, right? So obviously that doesn't happen without opposition, because obviously those people who are suddenly having to face those costs are not necessarily all going to take it as a good citizen, in quotation marks, and say, yeah, okay, fair enough, we need to own those costs. They're fighting back because obviously there's huge money involved. So from that, I'm not surprised that there is a big pushback. There's a big pushback, especially in the US. And let's face it, I mean, most Americans have their savings, their pension in shares, and probably don't have a 40-year horizon. They have a 5 or 10-year horizon, and they want their shares to perform, and they don't want them to take it. So of course, it's logical that there is a much bigger pushback in the US than, let's say, in Europe, where there's far less reliance on capital stock pension systems rather than on pay-as-you-go sort of state-funded pension systems, which makes them a bit more agnostic to that. So there's therefore that pushback, which again for me is logical, but I think it's a temporary setback. It's not going to be something that's going to, because the fundamental trends are still the same and going to sort of hit us. Now, that's one thing. The other thing I think what I'm observing is just the confusion among many people, and I think there's just too much jargon out there. There are also too many so-called specialists that the same in finance. People love throwing around jargon, makes them feel they're part of an exclusive circle that others don't understand, and it makes you feel more elitist. And you have the same in sustainability, where people just bask in that sort of sunshine of exclusivity that nobody else understands. So I think it hasn't necessarily done itself any favor in not trying to really speak a plain language, whether it's English in most cases or German or whatever. But just the need to sort of, I think, not just talk to your own echo chamber of sustainability specialists that buy into all the things you say anyway, but you need to basically take the all the other stakeholders, of existing stakeholders of companies, new stakeholders. You need to take them with you, and I think that hasn't happened enough. And I think there's obviously with something so big, there's a cacophony, so there are too many people speaking with too many different things, and that hasn't helped either. That's why for me, going back, I like the simplicity about you need to own up the costs that you cause as a company, because those costs have become too big. And the term, again, I use it a lot, the internalization of negative externalities. But if you think about that for me is what sustainability is about. And if you think about, okay, what does that mean? It means companies need to own up to the costs. What does that mean for them? Their business model may be challenged. They need to pivot, they need to adapt. From that, all becomes logical. It's not just about ticking the regulatory box and being compliant with, law A or law B or law C. Right? If you think from that, anyway, that's my attempt to try to sort of accelerate and get to a higher pace.
No, Johannes, I love that. That was again some absolute gold for anybody that's out there, kind of thinking, I guess, from a company perspective about embarking on their sustainability journey, if you like, and sort of where do you start? And actually, as you say, perhaps not starting with the grand vision, if you like, that I think a lot of organizations do, and it's the meaninglessness sometimes of the words, and as you say, the jargon that we use, but instead it's viewing those external negative externalities and seeing what we as an organization can hold our hands up to, essentially. Yeah. So yeah, really, really interesting. Let me ask you, again, kind of specifically pulling out of this article, but relating it to obviously the work that you're doing with S Cubed. Like, you've explained a little bit about the work, what you're developing, but how does kind of perceptions of ESG and the impact of ESG on, or sustainability, should I say, on the kind of investment function, like how does that play into, and how does that influence what you're building with S Cubed?
So I think what we are focusing on, initially mentioned, I think that trinity of the intention, willingness, strategy, let's say on the one hand, the financial viability of the business model on the second hand, and on third, the technical know-how to adapt to transition. So we're really focusing on the business model viability. And as a minimum viable product, we're focusing on, okay, where are we now? Where's the company now? Comparing that to its peers. But where we want to go is really sort of making those contingent liabilities visible, right? Not just in terms of disclosure, which standard you adhere to, or but what does it mean, sort of in terms of actual costs? And even if those costs are not yet in the P&L, they're off balance sheet. The equivalent I always use is derivatives. If you company engage in derivative trading, or you have derivatives to secure certain, let's say, interest rates or foreign currency transactions, you basically look ahead and you don't know what the value of your derivative transaction is going to be, but you basically make certain scenarios. So you have potential future exposure curves. So different scenarios for different time buckets. So you basically simply, okay, under a negative scenario, my exposure may be, this much. Under a more benign scenario, maybe a bit lower, etc. So I think ultimately we need to sort of do the same, reflect what these externalities cost, and of course it's going to be sort of impossible to be exact, right? So you can just approach it via certain scenarios but it allows people to have a better handle on how different companies are exposed to these changes. That's where I want to go. And again, I want to speak the financial language that people are used to, right? I don't want to speak in terms of, let's say, double materiality and having to define impact materiality or whatever else you talk about. I just want to sort of talk a language that I'm not saying Joe Blogs, but not everybody understands financial language either, but the key people in a company understand without having to become sustainability experts, right? That's at least my aim and intention and objective.
Awesome. It's awesome. We've rattled through, Johannes. I feel like as I say, episode 2 and 3 will very much be on the cards if you haven't had too much of a terrible time with me today. But let me ask you to finish. We always ask for people to share, that kind of a key bit of advice, something that they would have offered to their younger self that would have been helpful on career path. Can you share something with us?
Obviously, hindsight's always a wonderful thing.
That'll do.
I think I am really enjoying doing my own thing. If I look at, I think the support that is out there for startups nowadays, I'm sure that wasn't there 15, 20 years ago. If I just look at some of the applications I mentioned to you, on the legal side, on the fundraising side, the market was a very different one. So therefore, it's perhaps an unrealistic wish. Also, my personal situation was a different one with 3 young children at some stage, having to go to school and then university. Sort of, it's obviously, you value certain aspects differently than I do now, where I have a bit more liberty. But I do think, so finding something, and it sounds like a big cliche, but I really now
We
believe
love a cliche at the end.
Sorry?
We love a cliche at the end. Give us a nice big cliche.
Yeah, I think I believe in what I'm doing, and again, not because I feel I'm saving humanity, but I feel it makes sense. It's completely logical, and that's what makes me tick, right? So I think generally relatively rational person, and therefore for me, having found something that I think is eminently logical, makes sense, and can help, obviously it contributes to a bigger positive picture. I think that is very, very motivating. And I wish probably well, put it this way. I wish I was 20 years younger, put it this way, that I had another 40 years, to be able to do that. I don't want to work another 40 years. So, but that's perhaps my wish I would have. So, being on this journey as a 30-year-old would be amazing.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Brilliant. Well, as we say, all fascinating stuff in terms of career paths that people will ultimately choose. And as you say, the kind of the timing and the context of 20 years ago versus now is different. But it's an interesting one in terms of encouraging people to think differently, I think, about maybe the options available to them, and how you say there is support available for people if they want to challenge themselves, and well, not just challenge themselves, but if they want to take that on as an entrepreneur or somebody that wants to build something themselves. Johannes, that was super helpful. Thank you so much for joining us for that kind of 50 minutes or so. It's rattled by, but yeah, thank you very much for joining us today.
Real pleasure. And thank you very much for inviting me. I enjoyed it a lot.
Top man. Thanks, Johannes.